All right, all right. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Talk the Ting with a new look. With a new look,
Tell us how you like the new look.
upgrade. Yeah, let us
Well,
know in
well,
the comments,
fresh.
man. How do you like the new look? Like we always say, we're trying to bring positive and bring good vibes, and we're trying to everything that we get, we're trying to reinvest into the show to try to make it a little bit better as we go along. So if I didn't introduce myself, my name is Dwayne. I'm one of the hosts of the show tonight. Rajiv, introduce
I'm
yourself.
Rajiv. I'm one of the hosts for tonight as well.
All right. Tonight we're gonna have a very interesting conversation. I don't think this is something that we normally think about in terms of you know working in the utility industry, right? A lot of people don't think about how do you even get your power, how do you get your lights, and what are some of the things that that we need to be conscientious of in terms of changes, climate changes, and energy and all those different things. So we're gonna have a nice conversation tonight with Mr. Dexter Newton. Dexter, thanks for joining us, man.
Yes, Dwayne, thank you. Thank you for having me, you and Rajiv, and listeners and followers of Talk the Thing. It's an honor. It's an honor.
Yeah,
Welcome,
man,
welcome,
appreciate it,
welcome.
man. Thanks for joining us. So yeah, we're gonna before we go into that, a little bit of housekeeping. As we always say, we want to make this an interactive show, right? We have some questions prepared for Mr. Newton, but we want to make sure that we are engaging the people who are watching the show. So if any questions come up, if you guys have anything that you want to ask, don't hesitate. Put it in the chat. Comment. Let us know what you guys think. Maybe Dexter says something that really jumps out at somebody, and you guys want a little bit more information on that. um, you know, just comment in the chat. And then also don't forget to go onto our YouTube page, like, comment, subscribe. We're trying to build a channel. So any little thing we get, to help us, just hit that subscribe button. I hope it doesn't take anything from you guys. I don't think it does. So just, help us out as best as you can.
And
And
share
um
the live.
and share the live, share the live, share the live. All right. With that said, so Dexter, how was your day, man? How was everything?
Dwayne, the day was good. I was in Roseville. I'm in Dominica. I do apologize. I'm dealing with a slight head cold, so I was in town today. Got a couple of things done, and then I drove back up to La Plaine. So it was a nice day. Nice day. Nice day in Dominica.
Nice, man. Nice, man. It was a nice day here too, but the pollen count was a little high today. So I know Dexter apologized. You guys might hear me sniffling too because allergies kicking my butt. But we
We'll
have
take
to
the
let
weather
go.
how we get it right now.
Tis
Yeah,
the
As
man. Yeah,
season,
man.
right? The season of allergies is about to come on.
Yes, man. Yes, man. But I'll take that instead of seasonal Freddy every day. I'll tell you that.
For sure.
So with that said, Dexter, give us a little bit of background, man. Tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your background? And I hear you mentioned La Plaine there and
yeah,
Dominica
you
and
say
all that.
back up to that plane.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm a countryman at heart, born and raised in La Plaine. I went to school at the La Plaine Karen School, it was called back in the day. Now they call it the Jones Beaupre Primary
Yeah.
School. Went to the Dominica Grammar School, and then Sifoko. Now it's what is it? The State College. We
Yeah.
used to be down. We used to be down where the Windsor Park is now. And then yeah, I went up to New York. Studied electrical engineering up there. Lived up there. Two children, grown children. In New York. Worked in the utility industry for many years. Started my journey with telecommunications, and then jumped over to electric power, electric utility. So yeah, that's the background. Countryman at heart. I love the country. I love Dominica plenty because Dominica is full of nature and fresh food, and you know it is. So yeah, me in a nutshell.
So in that country boy upbringing, where did the electrical engineering thing come about?
But it's an interesting journey for sure, because La Plaine got electricity. I was a young boy at the time. I think La Plaine probably got electricity around mid 1980s. So prior to that, we didn't grow up on TV, but my father was an avid cricket fan, and he always had those big transistor radios, and at the time we didn't have lights, so he always had flashlights. So what happened is, an interesting thing is, when the batteries were worn out and were not good enough to listen to cricket commentary, he would put them down. So I'll grab that and wire that up and put electricity in my room. So I think that was the first really introduction to electricity. They say necessity is the mother of invention. So not having electricity was always a nice thing to just tinker around with that.
Oh man, that sounds interesting, man. I mean, I remember back in the day, my partners and them soldering little wires and all kind of thing.
Yeah,
My
man.
father worked for them like for years. And
Mhm.
I always thought I gotta tell people I never wanted to work in that industry, but that's where I end up anyway. That's why I met Dexter. For those who don't know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we have that in common. But
For
so Dexter, you mentioned C4 call. You mentioned coming up to New York, doing electrical engineering. How was that in terms of that process when you came up and deciding to go into the engineering how did you make that decision, and how did you find that? Was that something that came kind of easy to you, the engineering, or do you have to put your head down and graft? What was that like?
Yeah, well, I think when I would say I was always a decent student. I never considered myself an A student, but I always loved math. I always loved math and science, and it wasn't too much of a lift for me to sit down and do calculus and differential equations and those things. I've always had that interest, and I think when I came to the crossroads to actually choose a major, I considered civil engineering, but I had a good partner that Delbert Bopia. He's over there in Arizona. He studied civil engineering, and I was like, Delbert already going to civil engineering, so let me do something different, because we were really tight as children coming up. So and I think just having that interest in electricals, I should have mentioned earlier. I think music was a big part of my bringing up as well, my upbringing. And at the time, I was always curious as to like how the music worked, how like the transistor radios work. We used to listen to a lot of FM stations from Martinique, because I think Grand Bay folks, doing you're from Grand Bay, I think the Grand Bay folks, we have that in common, because we get a lot of good zouk and
Down
compa
south,
music.
yeah, man.
Yeah, man. So I think that kind of was like always a curious thing for me to know like how electronics work. So it was an easy decision to go into engineering, and it just blew my mind. It just always kept me very engaged. Even to the day, I always feel like I'm learning something every day. It's such a broad field, so really really good stuff for me. Felt fortunate to go into that field.
So throughout that electrical engineering journey, did you have an idea of like what career you were aiming for or where you wanted to be? Or was your thinking throughout the program, towards the end, job wise?
Yeah. That's a good question, Raju. Because for me, when I got into electrical engineering, at the time it don't look like it, but I had big dreadlocks, and big bob. So by the time when I graduated from college with my electrical engineering degree, it was tough. It was tough to get into the industry. They wanted me to cut my hair and shave, and my mother would put her head on her head and say, "Papa, bon Dieu, tu vois la baka tape toi vai." He need to cut his hair. So it was kind of a rough, getting into the industry was difficult, and it didn't help either that I didn't do an internship. And I always tell that to young students. I didn't know about internships because I was the first really in my family to go to college, and we didn't have that circle. So I didn't do an internship. It was difficult getting into the industry, but it was sort of blessing in disguise because I sort of met people that tell me, yo, take tests. And so I took a lot of tests, and I took the telephone company test at the time, and got in as a technician. So in terms of jobs, although I kind of felt like I wanted to be like in true engineering, once I got in the field, man, and I started climbing poles and working underground and working in the bucket, and I just fell in love with the outside plant and the outside field. So I think that really kind of took hold and kind of grabbed me, and I never really felt any reason to leave that type of environment. So I preferred it more. I mean, I went into engineering, traditional engineering. I did it for a couple of years, about 3 years, but I've always have a great love for operations and outside plant. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. All right. So, I mean, with that said, what would you say transitioning from, college going into your professional career? Like you said, you studied telecommunications and you got into the utility industry. Um, and then the outside plant aspect of it. As of now, what would you say is your area of expertise in terms of understanding the electrical systems? Is it power systems? Is it um um you know like you say outside plant? Like what is it that you think is your area of specialty?
Yeah, I consider myself a system operator. My years at the utility, both the telecommunication utility and the electric utility, I got exposed to outside plants. So I love operations. And what does operations mean? If your phone stop working, right? Somebody have to
Hmm.
come out and physically figure out why it's not working, and I enjoyed that. And if a car hits a pole and it takes out the electric system, like we have to go in there and figure out why. So I think I consider myself a system operator through hands-on, being able to go into, I would say, I mean, I worked in New York, and
Yeah.
people. I think that's probably one of the most complicated electrical networks, certainly in the country,
Yep.
and I would dare say probably in the world.
Yep.
So knowing and understanding that system, I think gave me some good footing to kind of consider myself as a system operator, and just looking at prints and looking at the way electric systems are set up.
Hmm.
I feel like that's kind of like my specialty, if you will.
So that's the I and before we go any further, if you don't mind, I would like you to just give a quick rundown of the electric system, right? In general, doesn't have to be New York, but just kind of how does electricity go from generation to somebody's house, and just give a quick overview, and then we'll go into the renewable energy section of it.
Yeah, doing. I think the easiest way to understand that is just keeping it basic. If you have a generator at the back of your house, you nowadays they have the push start generators. But imagine you pull the cord, ring, and then the generator starts, right? Like the chainsaw. The
Yeah.
generator starts. Similar concept. You have generation in the electric grid, and then you may have to plug an extension cord in the generator to, let's say, run a power tool in the garage, or if the wife trying to iron, to
Yep.
run the iron for her, right? So you run the electric line, the power cord. We can look at that as the transmission or distribution lines. Transmission meaning that they transmit over very large distances, and distribution is, as the word suggests, you kind of distributing the power to the localities, where it's going to go. You want to send it to Yankee Stadium. You want to send it to Macy's. You want to send it to TJ Maxx. So there's a distribution system. So you can look at your power cord as that. And then when it gets in the house, the actual switching over of it, where you make it become usable or user friendly, you could think of it as a extent, or they call those things, those power strips with like six
Yeah.
or four, six.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the extension cord, that's the thing.
Hmm.
So you can plug. So you can think of this as the sort of transition place where you would change from distribution to usable power in the home. So you have transformers and distribute and regulators, cap banks, all of those things to make sure that the power quality is what it's supposed to be. So very simple. So you have transmission, you have generation, transmission, distribution, and then you break it down and bring it into the homes where it becomes usable power.
Yep. And for the people who just to add to that, for the people who might not know, I mean, different countries operate different voltages. In the United States, we work 120, 208. In Dominica, everybody, 220 volts.
50,
So
50 hertz,
right,
220,
50
and then
hertz, right?
you
But
have
America
60
is
hertz
60 hertz, right?
sensitivity.
So, it's just something that you guys, anything you have, anything you have, your tablet, your phone, charger, anything. If you look on it, anything that you plug in, it's gonna tell you, it's gonna tell you 50 hertz, 60 hertz,
Yeah,
100 volts to 240. It'll show you all those things to tell you what you could plug it into, what you can't plug it into.
right.
That's why people speak. When I was growing up in Dominica, always hearing people saying it, they burn their
No,
thing. And
Give me that
no,
thing.
they, they
no.
order something from America and they plug it in at 220 and it's burned. So
Yeah.
yeah, man.
Serious stories with that. The boy said, "What?
But trust me,
About the radio, boy."
all know is like if Dom like take light here, people say, boy, Dom like burn my
Like
fridge,
with
or
my
Dom like,
fridge, boy.
you know, them kind of thing. It's like, yeah, man.
Yeah.
Dexter,
Yes,
we spoke about, we went from, the generation to the distribution, but, it all comes from somewhere. And, a lot of the talk these days, there's a lot of talk about renewables and sustainables. Is this something new? Is this a new talk? Is this something that, have been there from since before or whatnot? Is this how we source? Let's talk about sources.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Rajiv, I think we probably could go back. I'm sure most of us have the image of the windmill that sticks out in the farm. It looks like it has all these blades. That from my recollection have been used for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
Where we have wind power. We also have instances of water power from hydro, right? And I think maybe I would say maybe when electricity became the commodity that it is now, I figured they would have to have a way to make it, let's say, mass produce it, right? So the guy that had his little windmill on his farm to power his farm, that worked for him. But if you're trying to power a city, that didn't work too well, right? So then they had to go into this huge generating plants, and the use of fossil fuel, because it was cheap and available. That made sense to do that, right? But we read stories of Edison and Tesla and the battle between DC versus AC, direct current versus alternating current, and what the transition that happened there. So it's a long history, right? Over 100 years. But I think to answer your question, I would say because of trying to power large cities, I would think that's why we went into the more convenient and available fossil fuel generation versus trying to figure out a way to use wind or water back then. So that became more prevalent, but nothing new under the sun, right? And so we're going back full circle to say, well, the burning of fossil fuels, although it's great and we've made significant progress in really safely generating, transmitting, distributing, and using electricity. We hardly hear, knock on wood, of folks getting in between voltages anymore, getting electrocuted or whatever. You do have the here and there mishaps,
Mm-hmm.
but for the most part it's a safe commodity, right? And Dwayne, I think you mentioned people expectation, my expectation, your expectation is when you enter your bathroom and you flip up that switch, the light has to come on.
Let you come on. Yep.
Right. So you don't even think of electricity, you think of whether your light is coming on, and that is the commodity that we deal with. Yeah.
Especially, I would say, especially in New York, right? New York people have no tolerance for that, boy. All these blackouts and all these things we have in Dominica is like nobody wants that. So that's why people pay a top dollar to have reliability, right, and to make sure that. So
Yeah.
that becomes the challenge. But one of the things I wanted to just ask real quick on one of the points you made, do you think, and I don't know, this is your personal opinion, I guess you will answer it if you want to, But what do you think? How much do you think that our pursuits of profits, right, as men, right, as people, led to some of the decisions we made in the past when it comes to fossil fuels versus, you know, renewable sources?
Yeah, yeah. Well, listen, we live in a capitalist society, and I mean, folks have the means of production, and they see what works and what can make them money. So I would say, yeah, I'm sure that had a huge pull on the direction that they went with that, right? Even AC versus DC, right? I'm
I was,
sure,
I was just gonna say,
it was probably an economic
yep,
decision
yep.
as to who should go forward and who shouldn't, so yeah.
I was just gonna say it's funny because every time I hear the story of Nikola Tesla versus Thomas Edison, and everybody knows Thomas Edison, but I mean, unless if you're really involved in electricity or you're following that, people think Tesla came from a car, right? People don't
Yeah,
think,
yeah,
you know what
yeah,
I'm saying? And
yeah,
what Nikola Tesla, you could say his invention or his um what he did with AC has contributed more to society than DC, right?
for
You could
sure,
say, right?
for
So
sure.
that's just something. So I guess over the years, right? How would you say you think that renewable energy, the landscape has evolved, especially in the Caribbean. We've been hearing things in Dominica about geothermal, and we know that we've had the hydro and stuff coming out of Loda for a while and all that kind of things. But how do you think things have evolved over time in terms of renewable energy in the Caribbean?
Yeah, we in Dominica, I think we, again, you spoke about the decisions, right? And it was probably an economic decision and a very smart one in my view when we decided to go into hydro back in the day, right? Because, if you think of an island and the chain of islands and not having the resource, the fossil fuel resource, to me, it is a no-brainer that we would go into renewables. And it's still a very, for me, it is a no-brainer that we continue to develop renewables in the Caribbean. I think over the years, the countries that have the resources, I think, have moved in that direction. But a lot of the Caribbean countries, like they don't necessarily have the kind of water resource that we have.
Mhm.
It still baffles me though, Dwayne and Rajiv, as to why we have not seen a more aggressive move to solar, which I think is a low hanging fruit in the Caribbean. We've seen a lot of development in hydro.
Mhm.
We haven't seen a lot of movement in wind and solar, and we can talk about and probably guess and discuss why. But that always baffles me as to why we have not seen that. And geothermal in Dominica as well. I know that's a hot button issue, and there's a lot of politics around that as well. Coming from the industry, I think we are also very, very fortunate to have geothermal as a resource in Dominica. And I am happy to see that we have at least attempted to develop the resource. We could argue as to the length of time that it's taken to get that done, but that's a whole other thing. Not for an electrical engineer to a utility person to discuss. Probably project managers. I know we have some project managers in that.
Well, I don't think they want the project manager opinion tonight. Another night.
Yeah, yeah.
But you mentioned, we could talk about some of the reasons why, but don't you think maybe cost perhaps might be argued as a factor? Because while yes, we might have a lot of sun shining, but maybe the stakeholders figure, well, perhaps fuel still is cheaper than deploying solar panels, and also geography, topography. I mean, where would we put them?
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I'm sure all of those things factor into the heads of the big guns, that make those type of decisions. But Rajiv, one of the things I would say, and we can get a little bit more into that, when we start looking at resilience, right? That then the equation, and maybe 10, 15 years ago, it probably wasn't as important to consider this. But when you start thinking of resilience after Hurricane Maria, right? I know Lapland, it took 8 months, before Lapland, Domlek came back to Lapland. So
Wow.
imagine not having electricity or running a generator for 8 months, my brother, is no easy task, right? So we start thinking of, okay, yeah, it's an economic reason and it might be expensive to do this and whatever, But then when you start thinking of, well, okay, when you do have a resilient event, like a hurricane, tropical, uh,
So
a storm
Tropical
like
storm, yep.
a storm like Category 5 is what I was thinking. When you have a Category 5 resilient event like a Maria, everything flat, then how do you build back and come back quickly to get industry running and stuff like that, So I think those are the kind of decisions that we have to be thinking about and talking about in the region. And of course, we see the global tension, between the countries that do have the resources, like the natural gas reserve and the oil reserve, and where do we fit in the whole scheme of things, and can we afford to be left in such a vulnerable place? You know what I mean? So these are things that I think we need to get a handle on and start thinking about as a people and as a region.
do you think it's a matter of going all in one direction, or still keeping fossil fuels in the loop? Because you see, for example, one of our nearest neighbors, like Guyana, just discovered so much oil. I mean,
All right.
they are going to stop because that's a big check for them. So,
Correct.
do you think it's something where we should be taking advantage of everything all at once?
Yeah, I am of the belief that we do a transition, a slow transition. I don't think there is necessarily, well, we all understand that when you burn fossil fuel, what happens to the environment, right? That's a given. Um, we see the same thing, for example, in Dominica. We love our trees, but hey, if you're trying to develop a tram or a trail or an airport, I mean, you kind of have to cut down some trees. It hurts, but it's something that you have to do. So I to answer the question, I think I like the idea of all of the above, but I also think that we have to use common sense and make that transition, which makes sense for our people. So yes, fossil fuel is available, and yes, solar and other distributed energy resources do have a high capital cost, and we've seen the cost come down a bit over the years, significantly actually over the years, over the past, say, 10, 15 years. So we expect that, again, the more you put into it, the cheaper it becomes to produce. So I think we definitely need to win ourselves of fossil fuel, because Nupani,
Yeah.
we don't have the resource.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I remember a few years ago when solar started becoming, I guess you want to call it a big thing in the US. The government was giving, well, not just the state, but the federal government was giving significant incentives, right,
Sure.
for homeowners to put solar on their homes.
Mhm.
And as you said, the cost has come down significantly because more people are getting it, right? Just
Right.
economies of scale, right? But
Mhm.
at the same time, I still think, the political back and forth, if you want to call it that, right? One administration wants something, like we still haven't gotten to the place where we fully acknowledge that this is a problem, and something that we all need to tackle all
Yeah.
together. And I guess I wanted to, I'm prefacing that to ask, in terms of Caribbean governments, right, and not just in terms of renewable energy, but what are your thoughts on what the Caribbean governments are giving, or maybe if you know more about Dominica, if somebody wants to get solar in Dominica, what type of system is there set up? Is there any kind of help that the government will give to that person if they could get their stuff, and is there any kind of credit they get for taxes, or how does that work?
No,
Not
I
just
do
the
not.
government, but the provider as well. If the provider offers any incentives that you know of.
Yeah, the only incentive that I know that is offered, as it relates to renewable energy in Dominica, is a reduction in the import duties on renewable energy products. I want to say that the import duty is about 23%. Um, I could be wrong on the numbers, but I know that there have been some incentives given to system, but it has to be a complete system. So you cannot bring an inverter and get that as a user, right? You cannot bring an inverter and get the discount. You have to bring in a full system to get the incentive. That is the way I understand it. I stand corrected if somebody has a different information. But as far as other incentives, I do not believe that we have other incentives as it relates to solar PV. I know for the electric cars as well. I was talking to a gentleman who works in the in on that side of government, and he was telling me that it's actually cheaper to import a electric vehicle into Dominica than a conventional vehicle because of some of the incentives that is given in that. So we do have some of those reduction in import taxes. Other than that, I think Dominica, just thinking of our position as it relates to renewable energy, if you think of Dominica and you consider the fact that we do have hydro and we do have geothermal coming on stream, if we put those two together, Dominica is actually pretty good.
Pretty good, right?
Yeah, as it relates to renewable energy. I think where I would give them low marks is their focus have been mainly on geothermal, and I think the low hanging fruit of solar. We have not aggressively gone after solar. But interestingly enough, though, Dominicans are the ones, the regular mom and pops are the ones that are showing very, very strong interest in solar and are going 100%, full bobbing, towards solar and developing their
A
thing
lot
in
of
any way they can.
too.
Can you say that again?
I say a lot of businesses too. If you look at KFC, Auto
Yeah.
Trade, everybody
Yeah.
have panels on their rooftop now.
But my brother, it makes sense. I mean, why would you not,
It's a resource you have, yep.
yeah, Dominica, you're talking about 7 hours of serious sunlight all day.
All this.
You know what I mean? So, we have our periodic rainfall, but our
Unless
rainfall
if you're
is
in Pocassi, yeah? If you're in Pocassi, they don't have much.
but doing, it's interesting to say that, one thing and it's something that I didn't realize about solar. Solar doesn't necessarily need direct sunlight. Once you have the light, so at time 6:30, once that sun starts opening its eyes, solar, you're seeing voltage on your system,
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Even Pocassi, with the amount of rainfall that they get up there, still has quite a bit,
The
and I would
light.
say adequate solar resource in those areas.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so to that point, in terms of you mentioned that people are, showing a lot of interest, right? Individuals are showing a lot of interest. Um, I'm just thinking here in terms of sustainability, right? In terms of, how do we make it sustainable? I'm just thinking with the solar, right? So let's just break it down. We get storms, we get all these things all the time, and people might be concerned and say, "Oh boy, if I put in solar, I spend all this money, I get all this stuff, I buy the whole system, I put it in, boom, next week a hurricane come and take it, and right, and then
Something that
after,
typically gets insured.
right, that's where I was going, right? So, is there, as far as you know, is there any type of like insurance for those type of things? Is it covered under your home insurance? What do you know about that?
I know. I spoke to one gentleman. I don't remember the name of the insurance company that told me that they do offer some packages for solar insurance for the panels on the roof. Um, I cannot speak too much on that. I will say from what I've just speaking to folks, I don't think it's a developed concept here on Island. Um, but doing, we have to be honest. I mean, if you really look at the grander scheme of things, the Chinese have made the Chinese have made solar, the production of solar panels, so inexpensive that if we really put that thing in the right thing in place, I don't think the panels are the most expensive piece of the installation. No, nobody wants to lose their panels, of course, but we don't sit there saying, "Boy, a storm coming, I can lose my galvanized,"
Yeah,
because
yeah,
we
that's true.
know, if the galvanized go, you buy a couple of sheets of galvanized and you put it back on the house. So the solar panels, I would say, if again the way that we have it set up, it still remains expensive. But if we really have to, put our back to it and really go into it. It's not that expensive to just consider the panels as the cheapest part of the installation, and they can be disposable, you know what I mean? But there are ways to set up the panels where if you do have an impending storm, you can go up there, disconnect your panels, put them down.
Put them down. Okay.
Yeah, and some people elect to do ground mounts. Same thing if something coming, you know, you have a forecast. You know, you go you disconnect the panels and you put them down. You know, you store them away, and when the storm passes, you go ahead and reinstall your panels.
Interesting. You mentioned ground mounts. Do you think it's like a feasible idea, especially like in a country like Dominica, where you could probably have like community initiatives, like, you know, if you have like maybe Lapland have some flat land somewhere that's not really in use. If there was some kind of community sponsored, maybe local businesses in cohort to the government, like they have like a solar farm that serves the Lapland, and then you work with the electricity provider. You think something like that would be feasible in Dominica?
Absolutely. I think community solar is something that we've seen taken some hold of a lot of neighborhoods in the United States, where communities come together and have their solar set up. We have not seen, and that's an area that is that interests me quite a bit. We haven't seen the kind of utility participation, though, where the utility is very willing to, you know, tie into those systems, and there are a lot of issues. There are a lot of reasons why there's issues of liability. You know, who is responsible for switching, who is responsible for the asset. You know, if you do have a situation where, God forbid, somebody gets hurt, you know, who is responsible. So utility is always like a little bit, you know, cautious on doing that. But it's not to say that we cannot come up with a model. We do have the Independent Regulatory Commission here in Dominica, the IRC. It's nothing to say that we cannot come up with a model to your point. If we did have community solar setups in a place like Lapland, especially in the outer districts, and set it up in a way that we can, you know, work with the utility company and figure out a way that it's beneficial to all the stakeholders. It certainly can be done, because it's something that is done in other parts.
Okay. I'm seeing a few comments in the chat there. Just want to highlight them, and I'm seeing Christiana saying it's an interesting fact that many developing countries have had real experience with renewables and efficient technologies because of necessity, and practically underdeveloped countries are catching up. They can learn from us. That's a really interesting point. I remember a quick story, right? I remember I was in a training at work, and I met this guy from Guyana. And I say, from Dominica. And he said, oh, I worked in Dominica. I worked in Dominic. And I say, what the hell? I said, boy. I said, this world big, but the world small, right?
Yeah.
So then, anyway, I end up talking to him. I tell him, oh, my dad worked at the power company. Who's your dad? Blah, blah, blah. He said, oh, I know this guy. Anyway, we end up talking. And then we end up talking about, before I left Dominica, that was years ago, we had prepaid electricity, right? And I was talking to him about that. So I remember a few weeks later, I'm talking to another guy, and I say, yeah, man, you know, they were doing the AMI, the Advanced Metering Infrastructure Project, and, you know, smart metering in New York and all that stuff. And I was telling them, like, oh, man, we've been had that stuff. You know, we had prepaid electricity. And I mean, what's that? And this guy said me, I'm lying, man. This guy didn't believe me. You know, and up to today,
Yeah.
I mean, almost 20 years later, we still have nothing close to that in New York, right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there's different factors to take into consideration, because legally you can't cut people light in the winter and all them kind of thing here. But
Right.
you know, but it's just showing to the Christiana point that we have a lot of things that we have worked on in the Caribbean, even in Dominica. And a lot of times I feel like Dominicans will think, well, we behind, but no, we actually ahead.
Yeah.
You know,
For sure.
I still remember those dumb like ads on the radio talking about the Amy meter.
Yeah,
But
man.
they had some funny ads when they were rolling that out. Even when they were rolling out the that's what it was. The dog not biting fellas again and that kind of stuff.
You're right. Yeah, I remember my partner was a meter reader for Dublin, but he used to tell me some stories. Yeah,
Yeah, man. But what would you say, Dexter? I mean, we've spoken a lot about, what it used to be, kind of what it currently is. What do you see as the future outlook for renewable energy? I guess in Dominica, Caribbean, and then also I'm really interested in your thoughts on kind of like what's going on in the United States as well. What
Yeah.
what what do you think? What do you see there?
But Dwayne, it's an exciting time. I know there are, we've seen the shift in political leadership, and the implications of that is going to be what it is, right?
Yep.
But the electrification of transportation, we haven't even cracked that yet. You know what I mean? And I was in the USVI a couple weeks ago, and the amount of cars I see in the Virgin Islands, I say to myself, boy, electric vehicles makes perfect sense in a place like that, right? You have very short runs in St.
Yep.
Croix, 10, 15-minute runs.
Mm-hmm.
And same in Dominica, right? Dominica, if I live here and go to town, I climb, but when I live Lapid and climb up Mount John, it's hill, 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 hill. And then from
Mm-hmm.
Mount John all the way down to Rosalie's downhill, you know what I mean? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it makes sense to have electric vehicles. So we haven't even touched electric vehicles. We haven't touched the electrification of transportation, So, and we spoke briefly about resilience. A place like Dominica, it makes sense to not necessarily depend on those long transmission lines, because when those things go down,
Yep.
somebody have to pick it up. You know what I mean? And if you have a distributed energy resource, like what Rajiv was talking about, you have a solar farm in La Plaine that is able to be isolated and power that locality of Grand Fort, let's say, to Delis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you lose your transmission system. It makes sense in my mind to
Mm-hmm.
go after that in the Caribbean, and specifically in Dominica, because of just the way Dominica is set up, because of our
Mm-hmm.
topology, because of the frequent storms that comes through. We haven't seen a lot of undergrounding because it's expensive.
It's
So
very
maybe
expensive.
maybe we can skip that, right? Maybe we don't have to necessarily spend all the big money on undergrounding feeders and transmission line. Maybe we can just do very strategic distribution of renewable energy resources around the island that makes sense for our type of setup here in Dominica. To the point, I think renewable energy has a great future. I think a lot of the focus have been to look to see how solar can be integrated into the bulk power system.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the big piece that's missing is how do we use solar and distributed energy resources, or DRs, to actually improve the distribution system. And I think we're going to see a lot of work in the coming years on sort of, getting some gravy from that, because we haven't, I don't think, explored that enough as an industry.
Okay, okay. Um, so let me just go back to the comments. Somebody said our infrastructure. Alban says our infrastructure is years ahead of some first world countries. Christiana asked another question. How do you think renewables can help support or resolve some of the load capacity issues the utility has had in recent times, getting into storage? I'm assuming she's asking about battery storage and that type of stuff, right?
Yeah, and she's probably talking about the frequent blackouts that Domleg had when
I mean,
I think they,
Manico and all kind of thing, So
they
yeah.
lost
Load shedding.
the load shedding. Yeah, that's a good point. Because again, Dominica's setup is you have generation around Fokole, you have generation around Loda, you have generation around Portsmouth,
Yep.
and then the rest of the country, we're basically pulling from those sources, right? So maybe would make sense to distribute, and that's what I was talking about. Distributed energy resources, as the
Resource.
name suggests. You're putting your energy sources closer to the load, so therefore you don't have to have that. If something goes out, you can also swap it over. So it really increases the and improves the resilience of your power system. Expensive, yes. What is the alternative? We know that when a storm comes through and then you have to repair and rebuild
That is
the
expensive too.
entire system. quite expensive as well. Loss of production. We can do the whole math, and either way, it's going to be an expense. But we're a small country, and the resources are tight. Not to say that we cannot think of it outside the box and see what works for Dominica and for the region as a whole. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. I mean, so in terms of young professionals, young people looking to possibly get into this industry, what are your thoughts there in terms of um, how somebody could target trying to get into this industry? I mean, traditionally, the most people who get into this, especially in Dominica, you work by Domlec and you
Hmm.
learn something, but you went the route of going to Call and you went to equipment, electrical engineering. You worked in that field, and then now you're pursuing on other things. Um, what are your opinions there? And then do you think? I mean, you've been working in that field for a while. You said you had your kids and all that stuff. Do you think it's a good career move for people to go into that field?
Excellent career move. I think doing the renewable energy is still in its infancy. I hate to admit, I spoke about the electrification of transportation. That in itself, as a young person, imagine you enter the industry and you go into the electric vehicle or the electric buses. We haven't even started talking about electrifying, you know, transcontinental or even regional aircrafts with different type of technology and propulsion. What's happening with AI. What's going to happen with when we start integrating AI. With smart switching and making the machines sort of make the decisions that we are trying to make as humans. And even the financing, right? Because one of the big things that we didn't talk about, and we sort of hinted at it, it's quite expensive. It's a huge capital outlay to get into some of those solar and battery energy storage installations. But what about the young folks who are interested in financing and who can come up with very smart ways and very creative ways so that we can finance these things? And maybe, a guy like me who is an electrical engineer and by training would probably not even think about that, right?
Right, right.
And that's a whole area that that they can get into, just renewable energy financing and that AI. So it's a bright future, I think, for young people. I don't think enough people are getting into power, to be honest. I think we saw
Yeah.
a shift of a lot of people went into computer science and
Mm-hmm.
coding and stuff like that, and we had a huge a need for folks getting into electrical engineering and power generation and stuff like that. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great time to get into the industry, and I'm not a rich man, but it's a lucrative. The pay is nice when you
Yeah.
work in those areas.
Yeah, man. And then to add to that, I will say that you know we had a recession in 2008 in the United States. We had COVID in 2020. The one industry where people kept making money was in utilities.
You
Like
need lights, man.
right there, everybody need light, and then,
You need refrigeration.
so the way that society has gone in terms of our reliance on electricity, right, is like you say. I'm really surprised that I don't see more people going into that field, because I think a lot of companies, including company in New York, is struggling to find good people, right, who want to work in those fields. Everybody want to go work for Google and MS, like I must say
Yeah,
MSN, Yahoo, and all them places there,
Amazon. Yeah,
Facebook and all them places. Interestingly enough, Dexter, today I was at a little bit of a conference with Hitachi, and they were talking about the data centers that Facebook and Amazon and them are building, bro. These guys are basically competition for the utilities, because
yeah,
they all the stuff that traditionally utilities will buy, power transformers and breakers and all these things. These guys are buying these things, and these guys are building out their own system so they could be completely self-reliant.
yeah.
So it's really interesting, and and I agree 100%. It might people say it might not make you rich, but you might be okay, if you go
I
into
think so.
utilities,
I
right?
think so. Because listen, we didn't even talk about that too, man. Data centers with the crypto and the data mining, those things churn a lot. They consume a lot of power,
Mm-hmm.
and the cooling, of those centers,
Mm-hmm.
talking about air conditioned loads. So, and they cannot go down, right?
Yep.
You don't want them to go off. So
Yep.
they are certainly competing with the utilities, and it's an interesting world. So that's a good point that you raise, and young people should, if you're listening tonight, that's a great area. The work is exciting, dangerous, yes, but I think we have procedures in
Yep.
place, and you follow your procedures. I've been working in that industry, knock on wood, for over 20 years, and we're still around to talk about it. So it's a great industry to be in.
But I think also, even if it's not directly working like for a power company, I think you actually touch on it. It's the idea of being a little bit more diverse in your thinking of your career path. Because somebody is mentioning we should look at biomass. Like, just imagine if a farmer was to be thinking in the direction of energy. I mean, with
Yeah,
his farming, he could still somewhat contribute to that. And then we just spoke about that data centers, and you mentioned ACs. And one of the solutions that I believe Microsoft came up with was, okay, well, instead of trying to cool it with air conditioning, we just put them at the bottom of the sea, and
right.
they've experienced results with that. So even if it's not in the power companies, then you can see that if you basically kind of outsource the whole idea of energy and renewable energy, if everybody in finance, in tech, if everybody thinking about it, then we open up the field for more solutions. Because maybe the person that have the solutions for Cornell working at JP Morgan as we speak.
Yep.
So
Yep.
Certainly, certainly,
Yep.
certainly,
Yep.
and it's one of the things that I like that saying that let's we pack our stand don't sell that.
Mm-hmm.
We all have ideas, and sometimes it's a finance person that show you a technical solution. So yeah, that's again diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a bad word nowadays, but we we know what comes out of it, right? The more
Yep.
people that could think of a problem and look at it in a more diversified way, the better the results that you get. And irrespective of what people try to say, we understand the power of diversity, and
Yep.
it's always true. It always turns out to be true. The more minds, the more thinking, you get a better product.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree 100%. You mentioned earlier a little bit a while ago that it's a dangerous, um, I guess, place to work, if you want to call it that.
The
What
industry.
what industry? What why do you say that? And I guess give us an example of what you mean by that.
Well, the commodity that we're dealing with is electricity, right? And we spoke about, going into your home and flipping your switch. Yeah, you expect the lights to turn on, but what actually happens behind the scene is not just a light turning on, right? We know that the commodity of electricity is a dangerous product, right? So you have voltages, you have currents, you have potential energy. And if you get between that, it can be fatal. You also have the fact that when you're working in those areas, you either working, like for example, solar panels, you climbing ladders all the time, you're on a roof,
Mhm.
you're working in subsurface areas, manholes, you're working on poles, you have falling and tripping hazards, so you're working in inclement weather. If you're working outside, when the winter comes, like you guys just had up north, those guys were not inside. I'm waiting for the weather to
Yep.
pass. I mean, some of them,
Yep.
yeah, we
Yeah,
know this.
yeah,
Stay in the
some
truck.
fellas like Roger Van der Lee inside,
So yeah, so that's what I meant about the dangers. It's an unforgiving product, and
Yes.
it takes a certain level of skill set and respect to work safely with electricity. So that's what I meant by the dangers of the industry.
Interestingly enough, I guess just to add to that, I used to have a vice president who said that electricity, the thing about electricity is right, you cannot see it, you can't smell it, you can't hear it, but it's there,
Is there?
right? And you have to make sure that you understand, what you're working with when you're working with electricity. You know, I've seen a lot of young people come into jobs and they say, oh, like they tell us all the time, right? You're supposed to do a job briefing, right? Before you do any type of work, right? And the job briefing is part of the job, right? You have to explain what's going on. The person who's showing you the job is supposed to show you, okay, this is dead. And they're supposed to demonstrate to you that it's dead, right?
Mhm,
And you can't be
mhm.
scared to ask questions because at the end of the day, I tell people all the time, if you are a young person and you think, oh, I'm scared to ask a question, I should tell them, is either you're scared enough that you're gonna die. So you have to really think about it like that, you know. You have to really think if I make a mistake, I could lose my life, right?
Yeah.
So if you're not 100% sure, you don't take any chances, right? It's the same thing with your house. The other day, my neighbor came and she asked me, she said it was raining, and she said, boy, she thinks water is getting into her panel, her electrical panel. And I went down there and I looked at it and I saw the water dripping in the thing. And I tell her, listen, cordon off the air. I'm not an electrician. Cordon off
Yeah.
the area and stay away from the panel. That's all I can tell you. Don't put your hand in there. Don't do
And
any of
call
that
the
stuff.
authorities.
And
But
call, yeah.
Call,
Yep.
but Dwayne, that what you did is such an important part of what we do, right? Because you understand your limitations. You do not have the tools necessarily to get in there and do what you have to do, and you
Yep.
made it safe, you know, and that's a big deal. You know, you made it safe. You instructed persons to not go, and yeah, sometimes that's what it takes, you know, to
Yeah,
yeah
man. Yeah, man.
to keep everything on the up and up.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
So Dexter, we're coming up on the end of the show. As they say, all good things must come to an end. What do you want to leave us with in closing? What do you think needs to happen to move, maybe small island developing states like Dominica, so that locals, communities, businesses can get more involved in the fight, in the journey to get ahead of the game? Because we still have time to get ahead.
Yeah. You know, Rajiv, I think I probably would say, you know, in terms of renewable energy and excuse me for my biasness, but I think it's something that everybody have a stake in, because at the end of the day, where you are now, right? If God forbid you have a resilient event, let's say a tornado or something comes through, and you know you lose your power, you know, and how do you? What is your contingency, right? What is this? What is the next thing that's going to power back your home so you can continue to do what you do?
Hmm.
And the way that we have it now, I mean, some of us don't think about it, but living in a big city, you know, if Connect goes down, you know, or if your utility go down and they're trying to figure this thing out, bro, it's not happening very quickly. So
Yep.
we all have a stake in the game. I think renewable energy and resilience as it relates to renewable energy, and I keep saying the word, I keep using resilience because I think then you know we think of renewable energy and we think of cost reduction. Yeah, that's a big piece. We try to save money, but I think now understanding that resilient events are going to happen more and more frequently as the climate continues to get warmer. No matter what the leadership try to say that climate change is a hoax, we see that the earth is getting hotter, so we expect more resilient events to happen, and therefore folks have to start thinking of what is my resilient contingency, what is my next option, and like we talk about healthy eating, I think keeping ourselves active, I think knowing that you have a resilient plan and looking at renewable energy as an option, I think is important for everybody to think about.
All right. All right. Well, with that said,
Continue to advocate for renewable energy, continue to talk about it, and I think it's an important thing that we need to vote for that as well. But I'll leave it there.
in every country, by the way, okay.
Every country.
Um, all right, everybody. Dexter, we want to thank you for coming on, man. It was really an insightful conversation. I think the people learned a lot. I think
I learned
we've seen, yeah, you've seen a lot of nice comments in the chat. The last comment I just want to close out. Bevin Etienne says ultimately we need to institutionalize energy systems in DA. Our schools should have programs that get our students involved in the space, and I think that's a good place to close out the discussion, right?
100%.
force people to get into those fields, because these things are not going away, right? We need to find a way to push young people into those fields. But again, Dexter, we want to thank you, man, for coming on with us. We really appreciate it. For the people who are watching, thank you so much for tuning in. Next week, we will be back with you guys. We're going to have a really different type of episode next week. So make sure you guys tune in next week. It's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting. And we're looking for a lot of participation from the viewers. With that said, take care, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night. Good night.
Okay. Good night. Good night, all. Thank you. Thank you again.